Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about restricting content based on player choice. What do I mean by that? I'm talking about if you've ever played a game where there's some content that you cannot see based on something that you chose to do with your player. I'm not talking about restrictions on an options menu. I'm not talking about like you decided to play the lowest difficulty mode, and because of that, you won't see a certain hard boss monster, or when you do, they don't use certain attacks with certain special effects because that doesn't occur unless you're playing it on normal or hard difficulty. I'm talking about things you choose when you start playing the game. This could be the build, this could be actions you take in the game. Build choices might be something like, maybe you decide not to take lockpick. Well, of course, this means you may not see the inside of some chests because you can't pick the lock, although some games you can break the lock. But it also means that in some games you won't see rooms, you may not see an entire map. You might not even get certain quests because you lack a skill that's a prerequisite to give it. But and while builds are a big chunk of this, I think even more so are player actions. So things the player decides to do while they're playing the game may cut off some content. Maybe you joined one faction that are enemies with another faction. So if you join one, can't be a member of the other. So joining one cuts off the content of the other. That's not uncommon, although there are some games that don't do that. Also, there are games where if you kill an NPC, some quests may not be available. Obviously, maybe the ones the NPC was going to give you, but it may be that, killing that NPC means later on someone was going to ask you to bring him something and he's dead. So that quest just deactivates. There's also one other kind that I'll just briefly mention here, which is New Game Plus. That's when a game restricts content until you play it a second time. Some games do that with classes or perks or even difficulty options. You have to play it once before it'll let you play the really, really hard difficulty option because they want you to see the game the way they intended it to be played. And maybe they have a class that's really hard to play or is not well supported everywhere in the story arcs, or maybe they have perks that just you only want to take that for a very particular build. You want to know what you're doing before you take it. They may restrict this to New Game Plus. I'm not really talking about those, even though they are restricted to a player action, which is playing the game once. I'm pretty much talking about builds and choices the player makes while playing the game. So as always, I've mentioned this on almost every other feature in this when I talk about it on this channel, that if you choose a feature, how you choose to do something in your role-playing game, there will be a group of people who hate it and a group of people who love it. So let me talk about the pros and cons of deciding to put in restricted content based on player choice. I'll start with the pros. Restricting content based on what kind of player character has been built or what choices the player's made lets you have a very reactive world. Very reactive. You will see NPCs treating your character a certain way. Maybe you picked a class that's not well liked. Maybe you're a necromancer and most people don't like necromancers. Maybe you picked an orc and people don't like orcs. Maybe you chose to act a certain way. Maybe you're wearing that really scary looking bandit armor that's all black with spikes coming out of it and people react to it. That's awesome. Saying, I wish I would have gotten people saying things to me based on if I wasn't playing those, you don't really want that. Now, you could argue, well, if they react to any choice you make, then it doesn't matter what choice you make. But there are people who go, well, I never saw those comments that they made to orcs or people in the bandit armor. And also, if you're wearing just like regular leather, no one's going to say anything. So there is non-reactivity to things you do. Closely tied, though, to having a very reactive world is this now makes player choice matter, which is something that's really important to me. You want players to know that if they choose to do something in your game, whether it's in the character creation screen or when they're playing in the game world, that will matter, that things will change, that there will be effects. I think that's really, really important. Once you start saying, hey, I want to be able to see all the content in the game with no matter what build I take or what I decide to do, that is not going to let you reinforce to players that choice matters. So player choice matters is one of your design pillars. You may want to think about making sure that you have some content that's restricted by player choice. I think a side effect of all this is your players will have a much stronger connection to their player character, and then through the player character to the world. When they see that things they do matter, this will make them view their characters like much more important. The things they decided, like maybe if you give your character red hair and people in the game comment about it, that reinforces that choice you made, and the player will have a stronger connection to that character. If you do something in the world, like you decide I'm going to kill all the mages, and then the mage guild gets really upset with you, and you're not allowed to use any mage guilds anymore, so maybe you can't get certain spells, maybe you don't have access to teleport discs or whatever. This changes the world right in front of you because of something you did, and it will make the world have a stronger connection to you. Don't overlook this, because some people go, I played this game and I just didn't feel any connection with it. Maybe that's why. Maybe there was no reactivity. And then finally, and this is something I mention a lot, is replayability. For some of you, you play a game once and never play it again. But for a lot of my games, I stressed having restricted content because I wanted people to play it again and see what happens when they're evil, or see what happens when they join a certain faction and the other faction now hates them. To see what happens in the game and in the end slides, because it makes the game eminently replayable. You might finish the game and go, I want to try it again, but this time I'm going to do different things. If you do that and it doesn't change anything, especially nothing significant, then you've lost any replayability that you might have gotten by having more restricted content. So I think those are the 4 big reasons you would like to have restricted content. So now let me give you, I think I've got 4 reasons. Yeah, here's 4 reasons why you don't want to restrict content. Kind of mentioned it with the replayability one. Most players don't finish the games they buy. Some players don't even start the games they buy. But a vast majority of players will never finish the game. I've seen this. This isn't even a telemetry thing. A lot of games have achievements for getting to the end or getting a certain ending. And if you look at Steam achievements for role-playing games, you see that a lot of people who play games never get any of those end game achievements, meaning they didn't finish. Well, if they didn't finish, they probably didn't even replay. Yes, there are a few people who will go back to the game and say, I'll make a new character, or they played it a little bit and went, I think it's this character that's causing the issue, and they replay. Most people never finish and never replay. So it's a kind of a good argument not to put anything in that supports replayability, because you're spending money on a feature that most players will never take advantage of. A second reason you don't want restricted content is it's really hard to pace a story if there's some content you don't know if they're going to get. And especially for narrative designers who think of a game in terms of moments, like this is going to be a really powerful emotional moment for the player, and I paced it. So like this happened, then boom. Once you have restricted content, you can't guarantee that certain things will happen. Either that or the only truly reactive things happen in content that can't be avoided, which is a strong argument to not avoiding content. Because if you want to make something really have an emotional impact, then, and you want that moment, like if you're playing a game and you have a baby with you and there's some chance that baby could be killed, but that's something that can be entirely avoided, then you just took a major emotional impact to the game and the game story and thrown it away. Related to that, so that's a narrative designer concern. For all you system designers, it is way harder to balance a game that has restricted content. If you don't know whether the player will see this content, whether they're going to get this item, whether they're going to run into this creature, whether they're going to find this really cool armor because it's in a section that might be restricted based on how they're playing, it makes it very, very hard to balance the game. Because you may think of things like, oh, well, we have channels of item delivery, and some of those channels may not exist depending on how you play. It makes it so hard to balance. Related to that is even guaranteeing completion. I've talked about that. It's very important to me in my RPGs that no matter what kind of player character you build and how you choose to play, that you can reach the end of the game. I think the game, it's a bug. As bad as any code bug, it is a design bug if you can't reach the end of the game with a valid player character build. Well, guess what? If you're going to restrict content, it may be harder to guarantee someone can reach the end, depending on the content you're restricting. And then the last thing about why restricted content may be something you do not want to do is so many players out there are concerned about missing content. It's related to them worrying about making suboptimal builds. You see a lot of people, before they ever play a game, they will read build guides that, by the way, ruin, totally spoil. They're full of spoilers about games. But they're telling you how to make a build so that your combat will be the best, or that you'll be able to pass all the speech checks in the game. Or even like you'll particularly find, if you want to find this gun, which we consider to be the best gun in the game, you need to make this build, and then you need to play this way. There are people who are so concerned about things like that, that if they find out that your game restricts that, they may not play it. They may go, wait a minute, you mean this character I made has no chance of ever getting the mega bazooka because I didn't take lockpick? Or, I won't ever be able to join this faction ever because they don't let halflings in and I took a halfling? This is insane. Knowing that you can lose players by restricting what seems to be, even to you, some fairly harmless content is a perfect example of why are you doing something that makes some players not want to play your game. And of course, the answer to that is, I think there are players who like having games that restrict content based on your choice. But then the question is, are there more of one or the other? Will they like it or not? Will this affect your reviews or your review scores? Which is why ultimately I say, just make the game you want. Every feature is like this. But I want it to be fair, even though I fall down hard. If you watch this channel, you know that I fall down hard on the pro-restricted content side. I want the game to be heavily reactive, and I want player choices to matter. These were my list of pros and cons on why you may or may not want to do that in your game. Hope this helps.